Ontario, Durham YWCA there, which I mistakenly at one point thought was like in Durham down in the south, but isn't. Before that, we worked with both the campaign and congressional staffs for congressperson, and I had the great privilege of getting to be inspired by it and working with Eva. I used to work for the city of Cambridge, and I also used to live there, and when I lived there, we served together on the Citizens Committee on Civic Unity. And the inspiration that you bring to everyone who partners with you, the success that you brought. I have only seen your successes at the YW in Cambridge, but to the community that you serve through the YW, but also the greater Cambridge and Boston community. Every inspiring event that I've been a part of in the last 20 years, 10 plus years that you've been here, I've always had a hand in. So I'm thrilled that you're here today to talk to us about both the YWCA's work to eliminate racism and empower women, their mission, but also to talk about your career fighting for social justice and racial justice, because we have people who are doing that already here and will do that more in the future. So we're really happy to welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I feel a little overwhelmed by that introduction. So, I'm Eva, and as Susie has said, I work for YWCA's. I'm in my 31st year of working at YWCA's. But let me tell you a little bit about me and how I got to where I am, because it's been a somewhat circuitous route, but I think it's all lent itself to this culmination. I was born in Topeka, Kansas, and if you know anything about Topeka, you know that that's the birthplace, that's the place where the case Brown versus the Board of Education originated. Not quite old, but many of my friends and classmates were the younger siblings of the plaintiffs in the case. Linda Brown had two younger sisters, and I fell between the two of them. One is younger than me and one is older than me. But Topeka was a place where I lived in an area called Tennessee Town, and Tennessee Town was largely populated by African-American freed slaves who had come to Kansas, who were from Tennessee, various places in the South, and populated a given area in the city. One of the fascinating things, and when I stop and think about it, one of the really fascinating things about that community was there was no differentiation in terms of economic status, in terms of, it was Black folks living together and supporting each other. So around the corner was one of the lawyers who was part of the Scott family that originated the case in Topeka. But up the street was the janitor for our school. So that gives you some sense of the homogeneity, whatever that word is, of the neighborhood. It was quite diverse economically, but very, very cohesive, and it was very, very much represented a village raising a child. I laughingly talk we went back last year to celebrate the life of one of our siblings, actually the person who taught me to cross the street in kindergarten, who died last year as a result of a protracted battle with cancer. And we went home to celebrate her life. And one of the things that we talked about in one of those kinds of gatherings is that, our school, our segregated school, was 3-4 blocks kind of in the center of the community. And there was Granny Mac, who lived across the street, and she was nobody's grandmother, but she was Granny Mac. And then there was Mrs. White, who lived around the corner, and they were the police for the neighborhood. And dollar to a donut hole, if I did something wrong and one of them saw it, they knew it at my house before I got there, because they reported on us, they cared for us, they supported us. And I believe very firmly that that's one of the things that caused me to begin to think about my life's work. And well, it hadn't been a straight line, but it's been somewhat bendy and windy to get to where I am. Just having that kind of support and that kind of community. The other thing that I'll mention is that I have a friend who's part of her thesis, part of her PhD dissertation, was based upon the fact that she'd done a tremendous amount of research on Black communities, not just in Kansas, but in the South, and spent some time in the Caribbean, what have you. And one of her premises was that Black people couldn't afford to make donations, couldn't do cash donations. And so what we did was we volunteered. We volunteered in our churches, we volunteered in our schools, we volunteered in a variety of places in the community because that was our way of giving back and paying back. And I grew up in a household where every year we had Thanksgiving dinner at 7 o'clock at night because we went to serve the Thanksgiving dinner for the community in the afternoon. And many of my friends grew up in that same kind of environment, which has helped us mold and frame who we are and how we think and the work that we've done. I'll talk just a little bit more about my career track, but I really want to talk about the YW, and I want to leave as much time as possible for your questions and your comments. So Susie's going to make sure that I don't overtalk my talking time. I actually graduated from the University of Kansas, homegrown. I'm a Jayhawk. I'm a real serious Jayhawk. Was quite disappointed in my team the other night when they had an altercation with K-State on the basketball court. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. Graduated from KU, started teaching high school English, and basically found myself in a very contrary position with the administration on a lot of issues around Black students who were trying to organize, Black students who were concerned about the quality of their education, Black students who wanted to, and I was the academic sponsor for the Black Student Union. And frankly, I found myself spending more time in the principal's office than I felt like I was doing other things. And finally decided I needed to leave the school system before they helped me leave. And as a result of that, I had some friends and some acquaintances who were involved in some community service projects that had gotten a very, 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 very small grant from the Episcopal Church to do some community organizing in the Black and the Hispanic community, the Latina community in Topeka. I had enough money to hire somebody for 6 months. And I thought, well, they needed somebody who could write grants. Didn't know how to write a grant, but I learned very quickly. That was real serious OJT. And write public information, write media releases, what have you. And that's really where I began my career. I ended up being there for 5 years. Because I learned to write grants, because I have a big mouth, because I was constantly in somebody's face about somebody's issue, and not in a bad way. When I say in somebody's face, I mean trying to articulate the position and the concerns and the needs of the Latina and the African American community in Topeka. And I had a partner in crime, a woman who had a similar kind of job in the Hispanic community. And we got to the point sometimes where the city councilor at the State House was like, oh God, here come Eva and Gloria, what do they want now? But that helped really mobilize and formalize my thinking, my work, and from there I moved on to other things and spent some time as the staff director, the housing staff director with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which was a really interesting kind of a position because I spent the majority of my time traveling around the country doing training and technical assistance with local governments around housing issues, particularly low-income housing. We did a lot of work with HUD. We did a lot of work with troubled public housing projects that were in economic difficulty or had some other kind of negative impact that was causing them not to be able to function effectively. And then I moved into, my tenure at the State House in Topeka had caused me to know many of the people who were in elected official positions, who were state representatives. And at some point, one of the people that I had worked with very, very closely decided to run for Congress. And I was kind of in the middle of figuring out what I wanted to be when I grew up, and still am, for that matter. But Jim asked me if I wanted to work on his campaign, and I said, sure, whatever. And I ended up being the director of operations and supervising the volunteer staff across the legislative district. He was elected went to Washington as his director of constituent services, and then went back to Kansas to manage his reelection campaign, which was a real adventure. One story that I would share is that we were in some little town, or we were going to some little town in northeast Kansas, and people didn't know I was Black. And that was their problem, not mine. So, you know, I walk in and I'm with a couple of other people who are representing other candidates, and, you know, I introduce myself and they're like, oh, who are you? And it was a learning experience for them and for me. It was a teachable moment on both sides of the equation, because I had forgotten about northeastern Kansas. But northeastern Kansas is just a microcosm of many, many, many communities across this country. Not just in the Midwest, not just in the South, but in the Northeast as well. After that, I married somebody who was a Canadian citizen who decided he didn't want to live in the United States anymore. And that's how I ended up in Kansas, or in Canada, excuse me. I had been working for the YWCA in Kansas City. That's where I started my career. And we were the largest provider of childcare in the metropolitan area. We had 900 licensed slots across the metropolitan area for infant care, through after school care, through summer day camps for kids in middle and upper school. So, you know, started writing to everybody I could think of in Ontario about, you know, I need a job. I'm going to be moving to this place that I've only been to 2 or 3 times. And I have 2 small children, and they need childcare, and here I am. Where is there for me to be? And one of the places that responded to me was the YWCA Canada, who said, we have this job in Oshawa, are you interested? And I said yes, and then I hung up the telephone, and my husband was already in Canada, and I called him and I said, where's Oshawa? As it turns out, Oshawa is in Durham region, and Durham region is the equivalent of a county immediately east of Toronto. So we bordered right on Toronto, and all of the work that we did kind of spilled into, and vice versa, a relationship with YWCA Toronto. So what does the YWCA do? So I was there for 15 years. I've been at the YW in Cambridge for 13 years. This is the beginning of my 13th year. There's a lot of confusion about who YWs are in relationship to YMCAs. So let's get this straight. The W makes the difference. If you don't remember anything else that I say today, the W makes the difference. The primary difference between YWs and YMs is that if you look at YMs, they're pretty prescriptive. And that's not a criticism, that's just a statement of fact. They do childcare, they have swimming pools, they have recreation programs. And in some communities like Cambridge, they also have housing programs. YWs on the other hand, are not prescriptive. We are very much bottom up. So we do what the community needs us to do. The YW in Cambridge has been a housing provider since 1911. I call us the grandmother of affordable housing in the Cambridge community, because that's been the cornerstone, the linchpin, the foundation of all of the work that we have done since 1911. You know, if you look at, there are 9 YWs in Massachusetts, and we actually are an alliance, and we periodically do things together as a group. But if you look at us, we're very different. For example, the YW in Cambridge, as I have indicated, is primarily a housing provider, but I'll come back to what else we do in just a second. If you look at the YW in Boston, for example, they've gone through a huge paradigm shift in the last couple of years, and they are almost singularly focused on their anti-racism work. They do training for the police department, they do training for the school system, they do training as part of their youth work. They are very singularly focused, or almost exclusively focused, on their anti-racism work. But then when you go further out, further west, and you go to, for example, the YWCA Central Mass, which is the YWCA in Worcester, they're a child care provider, They provide, they're the central focus of domestic violence work in that part of the state. And they also have a competition-sized swimming pool. So they do a lot of water therapy. They have a nationally recognized swim team, a synchronized swim team. You know, we closed our pool. The YW in Cambridge closed the pool 40 years ago, tore it down a couple of years ago and built, in conjunction with the Cambridge Housing Authority, 42 units of Section 8 housing. Because, again, coming back to who we are and what our community needs us to do, they need us to be housing providers. They didn't need a swimming pool. The YMCA is across the street, down the street, and they've got a swimming pool. If you want to swim, you can go there. And it's co-ed, so you know that's not problematic. But let me back up and give you a bit of history, because I think our history is really interesting as well. The YW was actually founded in 1855 in London. And there were a group of wealthy women who were concerned about the welfare of young women who were coming into the London area from the rural areas to work in the mills and other factories. And there wasn't safe, affordable housing. There wasn't a place for them to be other than what were then called brothels. Those were the only kinds of places where one could rent housing. And so that group of women actually formulated the first YWCA, and it was called something different. The name escapes me right now, and I didn't write it down, so don't ask me. But we now are the largest women's membership movement in the world. Keep in mind, we started in 1855 in London. Our world office is located in Geneva. There are 120 countries participating in YWCAs across the world. World Council meets every 4 years. This last World Council was earlier this year in Johannesburg. During my tenure with YWCA, the World Council has met in Seoul, Korea, has met in Tokyo, has been in China, has been in a couple of Norwegian countries, and has been in Canada as well. So the conference, the World Council, moves around the world every 4 years. The YWCA USA, actually, depending on who you talk to, either was founded in Boston or founded in New York. And when you talk to the Boston people, obviously they're going to tell you it's us, but when you talk to the New York people, they're going to tell you, obviously, it's us. 1850. That's when YWs began in this country. And as I said, both YWs in Boston and in New York came to be in 1850 for very much the same kinds of reasons. The need for a safe place for women to be, whether it was for housing, whether it was for a gathering place, whatever the case might be. The YW in the United States currently, there are 225 associations across the United States. 1,300 sites. Now, the reason why there's that multiplier effect is that there are, for example, this is not necessarily the case in Cambridge, but you know, there are a gazillion colleges and universities in the Cambridge-Boston area. There could be YW chapters, individual chapters at those universities and colleges, which then creates that multiplier effect so that in Boston, in Cambridge, there might be in that community 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 different YWCAs. So that's where we get to the 225 associations, but 1,300 sites of YWCAs. We represent 2 million women and girls, the interests of 2 million women and girls. Our mission, as Susie has already indicated, is the elimination of racism and the empowerment of women. That's the shortened version of our mission. The long version of our mission is, and I have to read this because the words back occasionally, eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. So what underlies the work of any YWCA in the United States is the elimination of racism and the empowerment of women. That's the driving force between all that we do, as long as we are in response to what our communities need us to be. If there ever is a time when Cambridge needs not to have or doesn't need to have affordable housing, supportive housing, then we'll gladly drop out. We are not going to and no YW that I'm aware of, will continue to do work in a community simply because that's what we've done for the last 99 years. It just doesn't work that way. Every year, excuse me, we have a national meeting. Our central headquarters is in DC. This year we're doing outlying regional training sessions in lieu of the national conference. One's going to be in San Diego and one's going to be in Chicago. So we will travel to one of those two places. The agenda will be the same at both places. But the whole idea is to try and expose us to the on-site work of some of our sister associations. So YWCA Cambridge was actually founded, in 1891. We moved into our current building in 1911. We've been in the same building, in the same primary building since 1911. It's been renovated a number of times. We did a $13 million renovation about 6 years ago. And it was an occupied renovation, so it was quite a bit of a challenge. We have two primary buildings, the one built in 1911, occupied in 1911, and then our second building is what's called the Tanner Residence. That building was built in the mid-1950s. Tanner Residence is what's called SRO housing, single room occupancy housing. We have 103 units of single room occupancy housing that are comprised of the Tanner building and the two top floors of our main building. The women who live in SRO housing are, the closest I can describe or help you understand what it's like a dormitory for adult women. The women have single rooms. We provide, every room is furnished exactly the same. We provide a bed, a dresser, a desk, what have you. They share common kitchens, they share common bathrooms, and they share a couple of common gathering areas. Many of the women, the majority of the women in our SRO housing are women who have experienced some kind of trauma in their lives, which makes it difficult for them to live independently. They might have been victims of incest in their families. They might have been victims of domestic violence. They might be recovering from some dependency, whether it's alcoholism or drugs or whatever the case might be. We obviously don't have the full gamut of staff who can provide the support that all those women need. So we partner with a lot of different agencies. Our largest partnerships are with AIDS Action, so that we have a block of rooms in Tanner that's actually set aside for women who are recovering or in some level of recovery or remission from AIDS. We partner with VinFin, which is a mental health agency. So all of the clients who live with us from VinFin have some level of mental health difficulty. We partner with another agency called Heading Home. Heading Home is one of the larger homeless shelters in the Cambridge area. And so we're their transition. When women are ready to transition out of the homeless shelter, but they're not quite ready to go out and live independently, they spend a period of time with us. And their staff and our staff work with those women to help them become ready to move into the community and live independently. We also have a large-scale partnership with the Cambridge Housing Authority. So of those 103 units, a little over half of them are supported by one of the agencies that I've just referred to. The other 50%, 48% are supported by our staff. Tanner is staffed 24/7. There is never a time when there's not at least one, if not more, people in the building. We provide, we've started to expand our portfolio in terms of our work with the women significantly over the last several years, so that we do a lot of programming, we do a lot of teaching, we do a lot of classes, everything from yoga to healthy eating. Everything from financial management. We've partnered with a number of banks and other institutions who come in and basically work with our women. You know, one of the things that, even though we're not a domestic violence shelter one of our strongest partnerships is with Transition House, which is the domestic violence shelter provider in the Cambridge community. Many of our clients are the same clients. And one of the things that we know is that all too frequently when women come out of a domestic violence situation, they've been controlled. Many times have no sense of their financial capacity, have never written a check, have never had a bank account, have lived under the umbrella, so to speak, of some person who has controlled them, whether it's a same-sex partner or a husband, in the case of women who've been married in that kind of a relationship. So the whole question of financial management and financial teaching is important. We do a lot of work around that. The other piece of our housing portfolio is a building called Renee's Place. And Renee it's important for you to know who Renee is. Susie and I, when we served on the Civic Unity Committee together, Renee was a member as well. She was probably the most caring, empathetic, but articulate and strong woman I have ever known anywhere in my goings and comings. And Renee passed a couple of years ago after a long battle with a whole variety of illnesses. And when we had the opportunity to move into a new building for our family shelter, we chose to name it Renee's Place. She had been one of our board chairs. Renee's Place is a 10-family shelter for homeless families. So at any given point in time, there are 10 families living in community. And again, they share common areas, they share kitchens, they share play area inside and outside, and we have a number of supports that come to us through partnerships with other agencies. Again, that building is staffed 24/7. There's never a time when there's not a person there. It's controlled access, so you really kind of have to explain who your mama is in order to get into the building, just for the protection and the safety of the women who live there. Very briefly, and I know I'm running into your question and answer time, and so I'll try and be a little bit quicker. We have three other primary program areas. One is the empowerment of women and girls. Our premier program, our signature program in that area is a program called GOLD. GOLD stands for Girls Only Leadership Development. We began this program about 5-6 years ago with then Mayor Denise Simmons. She's no longer the mayor, but she's still on city council. And when Denise was the mayor, initially she had a bit of a discretionary budget, and she started to do some leadership work with 8th grade girls. When she no longer had a discretionary budget, she came to us and said, will you take this program? And I kind of went, but ultimately we did. And it's grown exponentially. Our target population are 7th and 8th grade girls. They meet once a week, and they go through a variety of kinds of training and experiential kinds of activities. So far this year, they visited the Cancer Research Center at one of the cancer research centers at MIT. They've been involved in some self-efficacy work with the ART Theater. They've done some financial planning and we use actually staff from the Federal Reserve Bank to work with our girls because they are able to give this really global picture of what finances looks like. It's bigger than, my income and my expenses. There's a world out there that's a financial world. Next week is our annual Girls Career Day. We've got 18 women coming in to spend the evening, and I describe it as something kind of like speed dating, because the groups of women, the financial women, the public service women, the legal women, they will be located in spaces together, and then the girls rotate around. And they do that, and there's 6 different stations, and they'll rotate around through the course of 2 hours, and then at the end of 2 hours, we'll feed everybody. At the end of 2 hours, they'll come back, and they can then spend more specific time with women that they're uniquely interested in. We've got a couple of really exciting entrepreneurs this year. So the Career Day is one of the highlights of our year, and then at the end of the year, we'll do a conference. that basically is a culmination of the leadership conference. Health and wellness. We have one of our tenant programs is a gyrotonics and Pilates studio. They're a tenant, they actually pay rent, but we're very selective about who our tenants are because there has to be a synergy between who they are, what they do, their mission, their philosophies, and our mission and philosophy. We also have a Sobak Do program, which is a Korean martial arts program that is very focused on not just the martial arts piece, but the whole philosophy behind defense. And when you take a defensive posture and when you don't take a defensive posture and how you do that. We are a partner with a program called Sister to Sister Community Conversations that meets once a month, and they are singularly focused on health and wellness issues related to Black women and their families. And the trainers, the facilitators for each of their sessions are Black women or women of color professionals who are specialists, they're medical professionals, specialists in whatever the subject area is. So more recently we had one of the sessions was on diabetes. So there were 3 women who led the discussion, who answered questions. And the unique thing about this program is it takes place in a hair salon. And the reason why it takes place in a hair salon is it's non-combative, it's non-judgmental, and it's a place where most women go. It's a comfortable place. And so every third Sunday, I think, of every month, there's a session, a community conversation session in Erin's hair salon. And Erin's been a partner from day one, the owner of the hair salon. And then last but not least, certainly is our work with racial justice and advocacy. And I don't mean to, I don't certainly want to give you the impression that it's lesser of the work that we do, because it isn't. We are a member of more coalitions than I can begin to think about. And they venture from the racial justice piece over to the advocacy piece in terms of advocacy for things that are important to women. For example, we are one of the charter members of the Massachusetts Coalition on Free Menstruation Products in the schools and in public places. We've been part of that coalition for several years and have advocated, and David, you know that the Cambridge School District, CRLS, the high school in Cambridge, is one of the first high schools in the state who actually began to offer free products in the bathrooms for girls. And that's grown tremendously. Under the umbrella of the racial justice piece, we do a program each year. It's called Trailblazing Women. Trailblazing Women is an opportunity to recognize and pay tribute to women in the Cambridge community who have been leaders in civil rights and in the whole advocacy, racial justice movement. Last year, the theme of our work was the Shirley Chisholm quote, "If you don't give me a seat at the table, I'll bring my own chair." And that's a paraphrase, but that basically is a phrase that she is known for. And that was the theme of our Trailblazing Women. So the women who were acknowledged and recognized at last year's Trailblazing Women actually were women who were forerunners, the foremothers of much of the civil rights work that has been done around voting, advocacy work that's been done around voting in the Cambridge community. This year, Civic Unity, the committee that Susie and I used to sit on together, is doing a really exciting project. We are joined with the YWCA, Civic Unity, the City Manager's Office, and the Cambridge Arts Commission. How many of you have ever heard of a woman whose name is Fannie Lou Hamer? You know, I've asked that question in other places and people have looked at me like, who? Fannie Lou Hamer was a sharecropper, a Mississippi sharecropper, who went to the Democratic Convention in because I've lost track of the date, and led a movement that basically spoke to the issue that there was little or no representation at the Democratic Convention for people of color. There wasn't a place for them. She was the founder of what's known as the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Research it, Google it. She's amazing. She was just a real foremother to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and to much of the work that's been done around civic engagement. This year, we are bringing in a woman from Alabama who has written and performs a one-act play about Fannie Lou Hamer. It's taking place on May. We're doing two shows, one in the high school and one at the Cambridge Theater. And it's a one-act play about Fannie Lou Hamer. So we are really excited about this particular project. If you have an opportunity, we'd be glad for you to join us. So I've got annual reports from 2018. We operate on a calendar year, so we don't have a calendar or an annual report for 2019 yet, since we just finished it. But certainly you're free to take these and learn some more about what we do. And so I'm going to stop talking, and you can look through these, and if there are questions that occur as you're looking through the report, certainly I'll answer those. If there are questions about anything I've said, and Susan's going to facilitate because I don't do that well.
Thank you, Eva, for sharing not only about your own career path, but also all that you've done with the YWs and all of the YW does is very inspiring and speaks to so many different ways that people can make an impact in their communities. So we wanted to make sure we left some time for your questions. And I know, Kyle, there might be some from online as well.
I'm gonna raise my hand if someone from the chat wants to ask something.
But I see you in the back row. And feel free to say who you are if you'd like.
Hi, I'm Matthew. I'm a current student here at Helen. First of all, thank you for coming. And I'm from Toronto also, so that's fun. I actually know what that term is like. So I wanted to know if you could talk a bit about, you mentioned that you worked at YWCA's in multiple different cities and multiple countries. I want to know how your strategy has changed in engaging women and engaging volunteers, depending on where you were and how you had to adapt in those scenarios.
Well, let me start with the current situation first and foremost. One of the challenges, it's a mixed blessing in Cambridge, is that we've got lots of captive potential volunteers through the universities, but one of the difficulties we encounter, and that's that this is pretty much across the board, is that our time and the potential volunteers' time are not always the same thing. For example, people want to volunteer in our family shelter, but our family shelter is funded by the State Department of Housing and Community Development, and they have very clear guidelines about the fact that women who are in the shelter have to either be working, they have to be in school, or they have to be in some kind of a training program. So volunteers who want, and then our rules say that you pick up your children from childcare, you come home, you have a meal with your children, you spend quiet time with your children, and lights go down at 9 o'clock. So that creates some difficulty in terms of, where do you fit a volunteer in there? When their time is, I don't want to use the term program, but to some extent it is programmed. And that's part of the learning, because many times homeless families have not had any kind of structure around their lives. And so we provide something of a structure that helps them to think about and begin to become acclimated into being independent. In other communities, the capacity to volunteer or how we use volunteers depends on the programming. For example, in Kansas City, we were a child care provider. In Durham region, we ran one of the Ontario Early Years Centers, which meant that we did work with children from birth to 6 years old. We were a housing provider. We had a domestic violence shelter. We had assisted housing, and we had a homeless shelter. So, what we try to do, and I think that all YWs do this to some extent, we try to figure out how to help volunteers help us. And sometimes what that means is, can you give us 50 cents? You know, because we fundraise 365 days out of the year. I don't know any YWCA that is adequately funded. Not anywhere that I've worked and not anywhere that I've come in contact with. So we ask people to do things like do home parties. You know, can you sponsor a party and invite your friends and invite your friends to give us $25? You know, you may be inviting your friends over anyway, so this is an opportunity to support us. And one of the things that we try to do with our volunteers is to involve them in the work that we're doing. For example, well, this is kind of a unique example, but when we do Trailblazing Women later on this year, the Gold Girls, the 7th and 8th grade girls, will be volunteering as hostesses. They'll be volunteering as young women who pass out information, who help people find rooms for discussion groups. So that, you know, our philosophy is we start early. We're not going to wait till somebody is 30 or 40 years old and say, start volunteering. It's like, okay, here's something that you can do as a 7th or 8th grade girl to help us. And it helps develop another phase of their leadership. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you very much.
My name is Will. I'm a student here at Keller. My question is about cost per person and how you have been able to navigate challenges with the donors who insist on lower cost per person, per family, per day for your programs, and how you've been able to manage that.
It is what it is. You know, I describe YWs as operating on spit and string. I don't know any YW, as I said a minute ago, that's overfunded. You know, we have unit costs for our particular programs. You know, I've got some really good people in the finance office who are just incredible in terms of helping us to maximize the dollars that we get. So we try to do a lot of education with our donors. For example, this annual report is something that will go out to all of our donors. We invite them to our annual meeting. We invite them to other kinds of events. When we have open houses, we invite our donors. Now, whether they choose to come or not is, you know, at their discretion. But one of the interesting things, I think, and I think this has been proven to be true, is that once people get inside the facilities and meet the staff and begin to have a sense of how we operate and what we do with the dollars that we get, we don't have that kind of problem anymore. You know, now there's some people who are very adamant about saying, I'm going to give you $50 and I want my $50 to go to X. And we say, okay, you know, fine. But we don't get a lot of negative feedback around our unit costs, around what it costs us to run programs.
More questions?
I think as the leader of the YW Cambridge at this point in its life, if you could share maybe, what are the things that keep you up at night in terms of the problems that the organization
How much time do you have?
Maybe share one.
The impact of this government and its changing policies around funding, around entitlement programs. I don't know how many of you read the article yesterday that indicated that there's some move afoot on the part of this administration to begin to reduce Social Security benefits. You know, that's going to, if that happens, that will be catastrophic. There aren't enough beds for homeless and disenfranchised and underfunded individuals and families now. If we start to see that kind of rolling back of funding and support for senior citizens, you know, that's more than keeping me up at night. You know, and my staff laugh because you know, they get emails from me at 4 o'clock in the morning, and it's because I'm awake and, you know, I'm thinking about, okay, we had a building behind us until it was demolished that was a derelict building, and try as the city might, there were squatters in the building. And I didn't object to the squatters, but what I objected to was the fact that there was no protection for them. And my worst fear was I was going to get a call at 4 o'clock in the morning telling me that building was on fire. You know, the other kinds of things that keep me up late at night are the fact that in spite of the fact that we did a $13 million renovation a couple of years ago, we're in a building that was built in 1911. You know, it leaks. The other day, one of the bathrooms backed up. We had to lock the door until we could get, you know, our maintenance person and plumbers in the building. So there are all kinds of facilities issues. There, you know, the other things that keep me up have to do with our residents. What's the word I'm looking for? The complexity of the problems that women bring to us now have increased significantly during my lifetime with YWs. You know, we got so many women with dual diagnoses, and there's so few resources, even though, you know, Massachusetts is a progressive state in terms of healthcare, in terms of mental health care. It's still, you know, trying to find a bed for somebody who is having a breakdown, unless she's violent, unless she is a danger to herself. We have a very difficult time trying to get her into a bed somewhere where she can get help. So those are just a few of the things.
Well, I know it's probably not fair for me to ask, or if you have a 1-minute answer to a question that I had talked with some folks about, but we'll see if it is, and then I want to have time to thank you. But am I correct that the YWUSA having its mission explicitly be eliminating racism and empowering women happened in the last 10?
Actually, it was in I wrote it down, actually. Thank you. Ask me as soon as I can find my answer.
Were you with the organization?
I came in just after, well, let me back up.
Because if you were there or not, just what it was like for an organization to take that on as a stated mission.
There was another mission that preceded this one that was very divisive. And that was the elimination of racism by any means necessary. That was the mission that preceded the mission that we're operating under now. There were YWs who disaffiliated. There were YWs in the South who said, we don't want to do that. That's not what we're here for. You know, in spite of the fact that the YW historically had a reputation for anti-racist work, it wasn't necessarily reflected in a global mission. Once that mission was put in front of people and there was a vote at a national conference, there literally were YWs that disaffiliated. So by the time and that happened, I came into the YW in 1989. That happened the year before I came in, so 1987, 88. So when the current mission came into place, it was not as divisive. I think people were more prepared for it. Now, I will tell you that there is still some, and I don't want to call it resistance, but some of us are more actively involved in the anti-racism piece of the work than others are. And we have a new CEO, a new national CEO, new 2 years now, who is adamant about making sure that YWs, all 225 of us, know what our mission is and operate with that mission, with this, you know, this persimmon color orange that is part of our branding, so that people see us, and know what we stand for. That was more than a minute. But.
No, it was helpful. And I just think that having a mission that has power behind it and it can be controversial is something that not all organizations do. So thank you for that. Thank you for coming today, for sharing about your life, your work, and the YWCA. We're really grateful that you're here. And I think you offered to stick around for a couple of minutes if people had questions. So. Segal Fellows, if you're willing to come up for a picture, we'd love to do that. And everyone, we hope will take some food and speak with Eva. So thank you.
Thank you.